So, hi everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to another one of our CWS webinar series called Wildlife Chronicles. And today we're very excited to have Nirupa Rao with us. If you've been following us so far, we've been talking a lot about environmental education and the need for conservation through many different creative means. And hopefully today's webinar will talk a little more in detail about that and add more to that puzzle. I'll be moderating today, and I'm Ishika Ramakrishna, a researcher with the Center for Wildlife Studies. Today we have with us Nirupa Rao, who is a botanical illustrator, Inc. Fellow, and National Geographic Young Explorer based in Bangalore. Her work is inspired by regular field visits into the wild and informed by close collaboration with natural scientists to achieve high accuracy. She's also produced two beautiful books, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, called The Hidden Kingdom and Pillars of Life, in addition to illustrating several covers of Amitabh Ghosh's most prominent novels more recently. She's also collaborated with us closely on our environmental education program, Wild Shaale, with some beautiful illustrations meant specifically for nature education in young children. And through personal experience as well, I know that they've been doing beautifully, and many of the children really enjoy interacting with those lovely pieces of art. So thank you so much for being with us here today, Nirupa. It's really lovely to have you.
My pleasure, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for joining us.
So, Nirupa, before we delve into more of the science communication and environmental education aspects, perhaps you could share a little more with us about how you came to be a botanical illustrator. Like, how did you realize that this was your calling?
I always say that it's quite strange that I'm a botanical artist who studied neither botany nor art. So it was quite random, actually. I always liked art when I was in school. I mean, I liked drawing, but we didn't have any art class in school. And so until at one point I went to Singapore, and then I had it for 2 years, but in India I didn't have it. And I don't actually have artists in my family either. So the idea of being an artist was too alien to me, and it just seemed too sort of hi-fi for me. Basically, I couldn't identify myself as that. And I didn't have any concept that you could do of different forms of art. I always thought of it that you had to be like a Dali or a Picasso and have this kind of flamboyant personality. And so, yeah, I thought that wasn't for me. So I didn't study art in school. But although I always liked sketching and stuff on the side. And then the botany aspect, I do have a lot of botanists in my family. So there was always that influence, but I didn't seriously consider studying botany because I don't know. It just, I guess maybe the way that we studied it in school wasn't very interesting. I found it was, quite detached from my actual experience of going to the Western Ghats with my family. I grew up in Bangalore, so we always went to the Western Ghats for holidays and stuff when we were kids. So that was it. It had that influence on me, but then I didn't really associate that with the biology we learned in school at all. But then I think later on, as I grew up, at one point, when I was in college, I did an internship at the publishing house Bloomsbury in London, and so they published Harry Potter and everything. And I was working in the children's department, and so I was actually in charge of coordinating the books that they were doing in partnership with other organizations. So we were doing books with the Zoological Society of London, with the Royal Society in Edinburgh, and with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. All of those kinds of British institutions, and they were making these books for children on those subjects. So you would have my first book of British birds, my first book of garden flowers, and so on and so forth. And I was just quite jealous. And I was like, I really wish that we had had something like that that taught us about our own surroundings growing up. And the other funny thing was that despite the fact that that was the first time I was going to England, I hadn't been to England before, but I identified with so much of that landscape and scenery for some reason. And then I was like, it has to be unique because of the books I read, right? When you're growing up as a kid, you have so much of those like Indian Blighton and this and that. So like you have this whole association in your head of what like the English countryside is like, despite never having been there. And I realized like that's the power of books or nature communication or whatever you want to call it. That's the power of it. And so that's when I had the idea to get into it. Sorry, that's a very long story, but that's how I had the idea to do something like that. And I didn't know that botanical art was a thing, but I found out after that.
So where did you start? So when did you start experimenting with illustration, and what made you actually take that step? If if there was no formal influence, like you said, you didn't go to art class or anything.
So yeah, like it was after I just finished college and I was working in a different organization, and I became friends with the graphic designer from that organization. And then I picked up graphic design along the way. And then I used to incorporate some of my illustrations into the graphic design. And then one thing led to the next, and I decided I wanted to focus more on the illustration most of all, because that's what made me most happy. And I have a cousin, Siddharth, who is a botanist, and we were discussing, and we had the idea of like sort of combining our skills. So my grand uncle, Siddharth and my grand uncle actually, Father Cecil Saldana, he was a botanist who documented the flora of Karnataka back in the 70s. And so he's quite like seminal in that space in South India. And so we just had the idea of paying tribute to him in some way. And so, we thought that it would be cool to combine Siddharth's knowledge of botany with my own drawing skills. And actually at that time, Kriti, who I'm assuming most of you know who Kriti Karant is, but she had CWS, and she suggested that I apply for this National Geographic Young Explorer grant. And then the project kind of evolved into doing a children's book on the plants of the Western Ghats, because we wanted to create, like, even for people who don't have any experience with the Western Ghats, we wanted the book to be a kind of like a Father Cecil for them,
Right.
Father Cecil being my uncle, being a kind of like introduction to for all of these kids on how beautiful the plant world is and how like crazy and kooky it is as well. So we had like carnivores and parasites and flowers that smell of rock. Yeah.
That's so cool. I love how organically this has come about, and it's great that you had those botanical influences, because I think, like you mentioned, very few of us have been able to learn enough about botany through formal education. Even personally, I studied botany in my undergraduate level, and it didn't spark any interest for me to really take it forward. But engaging with a lot of good books and guidebooks definitely does help reinstill some of that interest. So, so then, can you also walk us through your process of creating these botanical illustrations? Because you're very well known for how intricate they are and how accurately you represent certain species. So one could even look at your illustration and be able to ID the species perfectly, because that's how closely represented to reality they are. So can you walk us through your process, and how do you get to that point of realism with your art?
So actually, like at the time that I applied for the National Geographic grant and I was waiting to hear back from them, I had this other, again, very fortunate experience of bumping into two conservationists who work with the Nature Conservation Foundation, named Divya Mudappa and T.R. Shankar Raman. And they run a rainforest restoration program in Tamil Nadu, and where they grow a lot of the native trees that are considered to be like keystone species of the region. And they were looking to document those trees in some way. And they had tried photography, but they came up against a bunch of hurdles because the trees were so tall that it was difficult to fit them in a single camera frame. And besides that, because it is the jungle, so the surrounding foliage is so dense that you in a photograph you just see a sea of green. You don't actually, it's hard to discern a tree from amidst all of that, and especially in sufficient detail to be able to identify any sort of characteristics of it. So when we met and they saw some of my work, we thought that it might be cool to try illustration. So that was the first sort of formal project that I had, and that's where I sort of cut my teeth in the field, and I think that like has shaped the way I've approached everything. So I would study the specimen up close, which was absolutely essential when you're doing trees, because if they had just sent me a bunch of photographs, I don't think I would have been able to do anything from that. So we would actually go out into and choose a specific specimen, and the trees are so tall that even when I'm standing right in front of them, I can't really see the whole tree. You're kind of looking up like that. You can't see the shape of it. So I would study the buttress up close, and then we climb up the hill and see its crown rising above the canopy. And then the intervening bits you can't really see. Like Divyanshi there would sort of help me imagine what the remaining portion would look like, because they've seen like a specimen of that kind, right, of that species, so they have an idea of what it should look like. So it kind of like it was a composite of all of those things. And I think that also made like research very important to my process, because I came up with a bunch of parameters that I would use to help them describe the species as well. So I would say, like, what is the buttress like? What is the pole of the trunk of the tree like? What is the general shape of the tree? Is it like sort of triangular and Christmas tree like, or is it sort of lollipop or popsicle or whatever it is? And also, the percentage of the crown to of the canopy to the remainder of the tree, the percentage of the buttress, those sorts of parameters were really important. So it was actually quite mathematical. I would actually like measure out in percentages what it should look like. So we did the sketches in person in the jungle, and then I'd come back to Bangalore and do the paintings, because, as you said, they're very detailed, so it's very time consuming. So I did take a whole lot of photographs as well. But like, as I said, it's difficult to photograph the whole tree. So you might just have like portions of the tree, and then you rely on your memory of what it looked like in person, as well as the sketches. And the photographs are an additional guideline. We're drawing like smaller parts of a plant, like a flower or whatever it is. Then it's much easier to use photographs as well. So I do that occasionally.
You wanted to also share with us a couple of pictures and a video, right? With
Yeah.
your process. You could share your screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. Super.
So yeah, this is the Palash tree of flame of the forest, Butium monospama is the scientific name. And this is actually, I had just started it. I started it recently with the idea of like creating art prints that people could buy and keep in their homes, and a percentage of the proceeds goes towards reforestation activities as well. Yeah, so the idea is basically just like that. I think that it's part of science communication for me as well, is just about sort of cultivating an implicit love for these species, because I think there's only so much that you can tell people, but they'll only like really. I think like change would only happen when people feel it, and yeah, that comes with familiarity, right? And just like celebrating all of the trees that are so much a part of our landscape and so much a part of our culture. So yeah, so this is one of the trees from that series. And I thought, well, I'll let it play. God, you can hear all the traffic. Sorry. Is there a way I can turn this down?
That's okay. Wow, there's so much attention to detail in even the slightest of components of this painting.
Yeah, that's why I'm like super slow. I think it takes me a long time to paint. But you had asked me earlier a little bit about my process of painting creatures,
Yeah.
animals, and stuff besides plants.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just thought I would show you a little bit of like sort of how much detail goes into it. So even when I'm doing trees and stuff, I tend to paint a lot of the leaves exactly as they would be shown on the tree. So like if you have like an ironwood tree, the leaves kind of point downwards. So then I would actually show like about most of it. I mean, at least like 80% of it would actually be outlined, and the rest of it would be a little bit more abstract. But
Yeah.
you see the way that, or in a jackfruit tree, the leaves kind of go upward a little bit, so you see the difference in the painting. Yeah, detail is really important. I think for me at least, for these kinds of species that are quite rare, they're not like if you're just doing a sunflower or a rose or something that people are very familiar with, you can afford to take a certain amount of artistic license. But then when you're working with species that people are not familiar with, then you have to identify even. I mean, you have to sort of emphasize even the smallest of details. Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because another point that I wanted to discuss with you was about how you can start to use a lot of these kinds of artwork which are so realistic for conservation effort and initiatives. And that's something that you've come to be very closely associated with over the years through multiple collaborations. Whether it's the books that you've created, through your work with Divya and Sridhar, and also more recently you've helped us with Wild Shaale, and you've made so many lovely images and illustrations of the species that children in these rural areas identify with the most. So you've also spent a lot of time creating intricate art for even more common species to um, bring about that love and feeling for your environment, like you were mentioning. So how did you come across each of these collaborations, and how do you think what has the experience been like using art for science communication outreach the way you have been doing?
So yeah, like I said, I think that was something that I identified with in a way that I didn't see myself as an artist in the way that most people think of it. But when I saw those books that I was telling you about that I saw at Bloomsbury when I was working there, I think that really sparked my imagination because I always liked academics and schoolwork as well. So I think you know how it is in India. If you're like interested or if you're doing well in school, you don't become an artist. Right?
Yeah.
So this was a way for me to sort of combine those two sides of my personality. So okay, this is the first book that I was telling you about. It's called Pillars of Life: Magnificent Trees of the Western Ghats. And this is the book that I did along with Divyan Sridhar from the Nature Conservation Foundation. and it's got about like 30 of the native tree species of that region. And so we show a lot of the individual trees. These are just two of them. The one on the left is, okay, my left at least, the triangular shaped one. Oh yeah, it would be your left. Yeah, that's like it's a species of Rudraksh. And the other one is a species of fig. It's a ficus microcarpa tree. And so you might notice some of the things I mentioned, which is like the way that the leaves are arranged on the tree branch, that and the way that the buttress is, the general shape of the tree, you can see is quite distinctive. And even if you're, you know, if you don't have these illustrations, you might not actually ever get to see a tree like this in its entirety unless you've like spent your lifetime in these areas. Um, yeah, so I think that was I loved working on this project. It was so different for me. The idea that Divya and Sridhar had at first is because they encourage a lot of like plantation owners in the region to grow these native species on the land that they're not using for plantation crops, as well as to if they can afford to use them as like shade growing species for coffee. So they wanted to, and the thing is that like a lot of the other tree species that we are more familiar with, that you might find in Bangalore or any of the other cities, for instance, are avenue trees. Most of them are brought in from abroad, and so those are the ones that we are actually more familiar with, and they're showy species which are specifically chosen because they are showy and beautiful, and so sometimes people prefer to grow those trees that they know and love on their land. So the idea of representing these trees species through paintings was also to kindle that same sort of love and familiarity in the reader that you might that they might otherwise have for trees like jacaranda or the rain tree, yeah, which now we are much more familiar with, right? So yeah, this book is one step towards that at least. um, that was that. And this is the other book that I did, called Hidden Kingdom, Fantastical Plants of the Western Ghats. And this is I did it. This is the book that I was telling you about, with the idea being to get children excited about plants. Although it's not only for children. Like I kind of did it for in the format of like a Harry Potter book or a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory sort of book, which is meant for people of all age groups. Sort of 8 years and upward, I think you can begin to understand the content. And I think like most people tend to think of plants as quite boring, and like devoid of agency in some way. They're just, you know, lifeless. I'm not lifeless, fixed to the ground or whatever. And if you ask the average kid, sorry, did you say something?
No. Please continue.
If you ask the average child to name like its top 10 favorite cars, right? Okay, maybe not favorite, but if you're on the road and you ask them like what kind of car is that, they'll say it's a Honda, whatever it is, like like, and they'll be able to name like Ferrari and this and that, right? The familiarity with those brand names is like at the tip of that. And then if you ask them, even if you ask them their favorite animals, that would be pretty easy for them. But if you ask them to name even like 5 trees, I think they would struggle. And I think that shows you the kind of priority that plants have in our current culture. I don't think it's always been this way, certainly, but at the moment, at least, I think they don't have pride of place. So I thought it would be cool to show people some native species that you can find in the Western Ghats, but which embody all of those characteristics that are like so charismatic about plants. So we have some plants. I'll just show you one. Yeah, these are sundews, and they are like you can find them even. Um, you can find them in like the Khas Plateau in Maharashtra and places like that. They're very common. But and they're really beautiful. They look kind of like jewels. Um, and what's funny about them is that they're carnivores. So they grow in areas where nutrient content in the soil is poor, and so they supplement their diets by ingesting small insects and stuff, that lurk around them. So actually, if you look close into this picture, you will see some insects in the process of being devoured by the plants, because it's sort of sticky tentacles. You can see they ensnare the insects and like gobble them up. And this is a way for them to supplement their diets and get the nutrients that are lacking in the soil. And you might notice also that their flowers, which look pretty conventional with the 5 petals, are held on long, thin stems high above their murderous leaves. And that's to prevent their pollinators from succumbing to the same fate as the insects that I used for food. So there's a sort of separation of purposes in the structure as well. But yeah, I think like when I was in school, at least, I did like ICSE syllabus. We did learn about carnivores, but we learned about like the Venus flytrap, which is native to North America. And we didn't learn about the sundews, which you can actually find like an hour from Bangalore. So I think that's just an example of how detached education syllabus can be from especially a botany syllabus from a actual reality. And I think that perhaps contributes to why it seems so abstract and irrelevant. So yeah, this book was maybe trying to change that. And finally, let me show you why Shaale. I think you were talking earlier about going into the field because you've obviously seen all of this in action as well.
Yes.
Do you want to introduce this program, or should I just continue?
Yeah, sure. So, like we had mentioned earlier, Wild Shaale is an environmental education program run by the Center for Wildlife Studies, where we go and we help reinstill a lot of empathy and curiosity for nature in many children around rural India, especially those who live very close to wildlife reserves. And in one of the modules we take to them, we also want to bring back the love of plants and the plant kingdom as a whole to them. And as you can see in the picture here, Nirupa's illustrations play a large role in this module that we do. So Nirupa, please like go ahead and tell us what it was like to visit these schools and see your artwork in action.
It was so much fun. So these are a few of the illustrations that we did. There's mahua in the first, which is very common in places like MP and Maharashtra and stuff. And then in the center, there's Tulsi, and then the other one is Sterculia urens, which is called Gamkaraya. So Gamkaraya, the ghost tree, is some of the common names for it. So the format of it, they would was that they just printed these images on individual sheets, and then Gabby Salazar and I think Ishika, did you work on this program as well?
Yes, yes.
The two of you together came up with a whole bunch of games that you could use, that the kids could play with you. So they were very modular, very flexible. And I think that was a great strength of the program is that so some of the games, for instance, is that the kids were like separated into groups and each of them was given a plant. And then they had to come up with a narrative surrounding that plant, which was based off what they knew about the plant. And you'd be surprised, like they know so much more than the average like city kid does.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Like they really know a lot. So like one of the plants was a banyan tree, and so they were showing So this one kid was like holding the picture of the banyan tree and pretending to be the banyan tree, and then all the other kids were like hanging off his arms. And they had like one kid sitting under the tree and like pretending to be a sadhu, and like it was really cute. And then they talked a lot about their local customs surrounding it and everything. And I think that's what's really great, is because we need to sort of point these things out and celebrate them, right? Like one anecdote that always comes to mind for me is like when I was working on Pillars of Life. A lot of the time I would just be standing by the side of the road sketching these trees. And anyone, like cars that walk past, would always like roll down the window and look at me curiously. And anyone who walked past is like, what is she up to, kind of thing. And like a bunch of kids who were walking back from school, and they were like they stopped and they asked me, what are you doing? So I told them, and this tree that I was drawing is a tree that definitely they walk past every day on the way to school, and they probably don't stop to look twice at it. It's just like any other tree that they walk past. But then on that day, when I'm standing there and drawing it, then they happen to be standing there looking at the tree with me and telling me that you got that branch wrong, and you got that it used to look like this and this and that. And then they're all like talking among themselves, and then they're saying, yeah, Tamil Nadu trees are the best. Like engenders that pride in these things when someone else is looking at it with value. So yeah, I think that's what why Shaale was like for me. And those kids are so enthusiastic, so like not jaded at all, just like really excited about everything. And a lot of them had, we also helped gave them paintbrushes and paper and stuff. And a lot of them had never held a paintbrush in their lives. So they will, we showed them the paintbrushes and they were so excited. But then they were like, what next?
Yeah.
Then we had to show them and like use the water and this and that. They'd never done it before, and it really burst my bubble in a lot of ways. Like, yeah, it was great.
It's so super because we can see in real time how much of an effect these kinds of artworks have on the kids we work with. Because as you'll know, we go back to these schools 4 to 5 times over a period of a couple of months, and we usually show them these pieces of art, and they get to do this plant activity and everything about 2 weeks into the program. And then another 2 weeks later, we kind of do a revision and a little quiz and those kind of things with them. And they still remember everything they learn about these plants, even though it was 2 weeks to a month ago. But they remember it so vividly, and they can recall all of the facts about it because they've looked at it up close. They've been able to look at the details, that sometimes even if they've seen the tree around, but like you mentioned, they're really massive trees and you don't get to get up close and look at the little details or see exactly how the leaves fall or the flowers form. So they get to learn so much about that through artwork like this. And you can see that, this is something they're going to remember for a long time and probably try to go and look more closely at the same trees when they get a chance again. So I think stuff like this has been definitely very impactful with kids. Do you see that the kind of artwork that you make has a different impact on adults versus kids? Do you see any difference there?
Um, I actually find kids to be a lot more knowledgeable, funnily enough, on because they are learning this stuff in school. They're learning about photosynthesis, they're learning about chlorophyll and this and that. A lot of the things that adults have forgotten, and you'd be surprised. Like you think you know this stuff, but it's been a while and you just like forgotten these basic processes, right? But the kids actually they have a sharper sense of how things work. But and then when you like I remember sitting with Hidden Kingdom when I was sitting with a few kids, because the whole script is written in rhyme. okay. Like we wanted it like really engaging, and there's a kind of momentum that you have with rhyme, right? Like you tend to remember the details also much better. So that was the intention behind it. So like we were sitting with some kids and their parents to see whether the level would be too high for them or whatever it is. But even if the kids didn't get, and we asked them to guess, like, what do you think, why do you think it's a carnivore, for instance, even if they didn't get the answer right, they had an idea of the logic, and their minds are so imaginative and curious, so they would guess why something would be carnivorous, whereas an adult is just looking for the answer. So I think it just like sparks that curiosity in them, when they're able to apply what they've learned in school to something that is a real life context, which otherwise they learn something in school and then it has no relevance, no application in real life. But when they're able to apply the two and connect the two, it works a lot better. And the other thing is, what was I going to say? I forgot what I was going to say. I think it's okay. Sorry, I forgot.
No problem. Um, so I think it is very interesting, right, to see, especially maybe it also has to do with the fact that you have a very realistic style that all age groups are able to connect this well. Because I think we have an innate tendency to dumb things down for kids or try to make them very cartoony and unrealistic. But from what we've seen, it doesn't seem to be the case. They seem to be really engaging with extremely realistic and non-cartoony artwork very well.
Yeah, so actually, yeah, this is what I wanted to say. It's funny because like I think it doesn't have to be the case that you understand everything the first time you read it. Okay, so like when I was a kid, we would in a different kind of economy or whatever. Like in Bangalore is a very different place at that time. So I was just using hand-me-downs. There were no like books for this age group to this age group, and like it wasn't so sort of specific, right? It was more like I would get books that my older sisters were reading, or forget that, I would get like books that were way above my age group, and we just read them. And even if you didn't understand everything in it, at some like you keep that book as an heirloom, and slowly you understand more and more. And like even if you don't understand it, it leaves an impression on your mind. And I think like with nature education especially, that's so crucial, because it's the impression that matters. You may not remember everything about this frog, or that plant, or this bear, or whatever it is. You may not remember all those fine details, but it's the general attitude towards nature that counts on a larger scale, right? So, like, and for me, like when I was a kid, my favorite book was like genuinely the book that I remember most loving most as a kid was this book on like the age of enlightenment. That I just liked the pictures in the book. I didn't understand anything about or whatever, but I really liked the pictures. So that was the book that I used to look at most as a kid. Definitely not for my age group, but it made an impression on me, right? So I think I'm not that like specific about having to make things cartoony for kids. It's the bigger challenge nowadays is for kids to choose a book over a TV screen. I think that is the bigger challenge. But
Yeah.
whether it's realistic or cartoony, they're both completely valid styles. I love more fun-loving styles of illustration as well, but they both have their place and they're both perfectly valid.
So, since we're closing in on 6:40, I'll wrap up with one question of mine before we move on to the audience Q&A. So, from all of the work you've done so far with engaging with the natural world and even with conservationists, um, how important do you think it is for these collaborations when you're looking at larger conservation effort? I think the marrying of the sciences and the arts are still very new. I don't think this is fully there yet. But do you think we're doing enough? Where do we go from here?
We're definitely not doing enough. Um, but like, I think we were talking about this earlier also, in that um, it's one thing to, I think a lot of nature education, nature communication in the past has been of a certain type, which attracts people who are already into nature.
Mhm.
Uh, so, you know, it's the khaki and the camouflage and the David Attenborough voiceover. And like, people who are, I mean, and of course, David Attenborough has like reached a very large number of people, and he's done a lot to sort of popularize that genre. But it's like everything that's come after that has followed that mold. So
Mhm.
people who already love nature are going to be attracted towards that, and they'll keep watching that, which is wonderful in and of itself, because they'll get like a deeper sense of the subject. But people who don't care at all about nature are not going to be drawn into that. So at least my aim with the work that I do is actually sort of to reach those people, um, because like I know that like my interest in nature and my sensitivity towards nature has come from my own childhood experiences, but that shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be like where my parents took me for my
Mhm.
holidays. And you know, like that because as we know, like my parents were pretty outdoorsy. My generation is much less so. Kids' generation will probably be even less so. And like if we, with increasing generations, if we stop having those kinds of hands-on experiences with nature, then that link is broken, right?
Mhm.
So um, I guess like, so every book that I've done, more, I mean, so Hidden Kingdom certainly at least has like a companion website, so they can read the book and then they can go online and learn more about the plant. There's further resources that they can read to learn about other plants as well. So the idea is like this is a stepping stone, and then now like go out and fly yourself, you know. So um, it's trying to be that inroad for people who otherwise would not have had that inroad. Uh, that's my aim, at least. Yeah.
I think that's a very encouraging place to end, actually. It's good to know that we've started and that people like you are doing some very cool and interesting things to engage people beyond the already committed ecologist community. Because I think that's basically who we need to reach next. And I think that is quite encouraging. I hope this catches on a lot more. So I'm going to start taking some questions that we've been getting in the chat box. So the first one is, what are some of the mediums you have used or like to use, and who are some other naturalist artists that you've liked?
The media, a lot of it is watercolor painting. Um, and the wild Shaale illustrations were all done digitally but by hand. So it's like drawing on a Wacom tablet. Um, so those are my preferred media. And the other question, other naturalists, there are plenty within India. There's Hemlata Pradhan, who works in the like Darjeeling region. There is Sangeeta Kadur, who's also from Bangalore, and she does a range of illustrations, not just plants but also animals as well. And internationally, some of the older people are like, you know, Margaret Mee, uh, who did a lot of work on the Amazon. Um, yeah, internationally and historically, there are a lot of wonderful artists. In India, there's fewer.
Mhm. So, segueing from that, Ashwit Chetty has asked, if I want to learn illustration from scratch, where should I start from? Is it okay to just start initially, or should I be sketching and painting? Should I be doing parts of a plant rather than the whole? So, general questions about where to begin and how to get that level of detail.
So for me personally, I would say start sketching before you start painting. Sketching will help you understand the structure of a plant better. And then it's super important to understand the structure. So like if you're drawing a flower, break it down into its components. You can, so if if you think about it geometrically, there's a rectangle with a cone and then a wall of petals that are based off of that cone. And if you keep that structure in mind, always, it'll even help you with your shading. So when you're shading the contours of a cone rather than shading a flat surface, you know. So definitely work on sketching first, and once you've got that down and you've understood the play of light and the volume of the subject, then you can move on to painting and adding color to the whole thing. And the other question was, should you focus on like a smaller subject or go in for the tree? If you're aiming to be more detailed and less abstract, then I would say go with the smaller subjects. It's much more manageable. If your style is more abstract, then you could do a landscape or whatever it is, and that's fine. But if you want to get detailed, then definitely start with a smaller subject.
Someone else has asked, how long does it take to complete a single illustration?
Okay, I'm going to show you like one time lapse. Let me try and find it quickly, and I'll speak in the meantime. So it can take me a really long time depending. So flowers take less time. Surprisingly, flowers are easier because they don't have veins and this and that. But trees take a really long time because of the amount of detail that you can. Okay, can I'm just going to share this.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Yeah. So this is a process of layering paint for a single leaf.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the leaves definitely take the longest because you're trying to show the Venetian in a way that it's there, but it's also not overdone. Yeah, so these like leaves of dicots especially are the hardest. So I might take like 2 days just to do one leaf, and I might finish a flower in like 2 hours.
Oh, wow. But you can really see that it's, I mean, it's of course worth it, every bit of time you've put into it, because I felt like every time that time lapse progressed, it felt like a full leaf, but then you still added more detail. It's incredible that you kept going to make it that perfect. So another question is, what are the major challenges when it comes to rendering a plant without distorting it?
Well, you have to be. So I do a lot of like background reading, and I also often like from almost always have a botanist who consults alongside, so they will tell me if I'm doing something wrong. Because if you're only relying on photographs or something that you just find online, there may be a hybrid of that plant, for instance, or it may be just that particular. So, like when we were doing Pillars of Life, for instance, I sketched one species because there was a beautiful tree that was growing on the side of it. It was another Eliocarpus, another Rudraksh species. So it was growing on the side of a hill, and it was very clear because it was growing in an open field. So I could see it very clearly. So I was like, this is the specimen that I want to sketch. And then I showed it to Divya, and then she was like, okay, so the tree looks like this in this area because it's growing in an open field and because it's growing on the side of a hill. But this is not ordinarily what this Rudraksh looks like. It's growing like this because of those particular conditions. But if you want to find a more representative species, representative specimen, then we're going to have to look at another specimen that's deeper inside the jungle. And so then we had to redo that. But so in working with a botanist is or at least someone in the know, someone who's very familiar with plants, is very helpful in getting things right. If you're talking more from an artistic perspective, you just have to notice a whole bunch of things. So like you can set those same parameters that I told you about. You can set those same parameters for yourself. Like, what is the architecture of this plant? How are the leaves arranged on the stem? How are the just kind of look point out those details to yourself first, so then you're aware of them before you start painting. Yeah.
Okay, the questions are really pouring in now, so I'm gonna move on to the next one. Nayantara asks, could you talk about how art could be used to understand or teach natural processes and symbiotic relationships?
Um, Natural processes and symbiotic relationships. Okay, so definitely, I think Hidden Kingdom does that quite a bit because it's a book about plants, but the idea was to show the entire ecosystem. It wasn't just about like those individual plant species. So, for instance, we showed the strangler fig, which you could see in. Okay, I'll talk about the picture that was on the cover of the book. It's an elephant yam, and that the yam or the corm of that plant is actually a common vegetable that's eaten in villages across India. But the flower, which is that gigantic purplish sort of mass, is it's very interesting because it's pollinated by dung beetles. And so it has like a form of pollination deception, which it uses to attract these dung beetles. So it emits a smell of rotting flesh, first of all, and now you'll understand the shape and the color of that flower better because it's meant to look like a pile of poo or rotting flesh or whatever it is. And it also emits like heat as anything that's decaying would do. So the idea is to trick a dung beetle into thinking that that's a good site for it to lay its eggs. And then eventually the beetle will realize the deception and it will move on, but the flower's work is done because the pollen has attached itself to the beetle's body, and it'll move on to another flower and pollination will happen. So we're telling the individual stories of these plants, but in such a way as to highlight how incorporated they are into their landscapes. So yeah, I think if you tell the story of any of these plants, the story is a story of symbiosis for the most part. I mean, not symbiosis necessarily, but at least like co-living, or that's it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One question says, what immediate changes can we make to the CBSE or ICSE syllabi to enhance nature education and increase kids' knowledge about botany or plants?
I think like immediate changes that we could do would be to get a sense of, at least so I did ICSE, and in ICSE we didn't really learn about the various landscape types that you find in India. We did learn the geography of the country, but we didn't learn like this is the Western Ghats. Even within the Western Ghats, you have like 4 different types of vegetation, like broadly speaking, 4 different vegetation types. So even if we understand that, I think we'll have a better sense of what the vegetation of the country should look like. I think a lot of people just have a misconception that forests are the only form of healthy vegetation, which isn't necessarily the case. You also have grasslands and swamps and this and like and people don't realize the individual value of each of those habitat types. So I think just incorporating that into our syllabus would be a great first step. And then besides that, I would also say if we could, even with the existing syllabus, like if we could just give examples of plants that you would find in India. So if we're learning about carnivores, perhaps the Venus flytrap is a great way to illustrate because it's very dramatic, right? Like the way that it captures plants. So perhaps that is a very illustrative plant to choose. But then you can also talk about another plant that you would find in India, and pitcher plants you can find in the Northeast and stuff. So why not talk about that? Talk about the fact that you can find it in India first of all, which I don't think was ever mentioned. So yeah, just like examples, and then I think just by omitting the fact that you just by not mentioning it, you presume that you can't find it here, and you presume that like only the Amazon or whatever is full of all of these great creatures.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a important point, because even I remember learning only about international examples of any kind of nature growing up. And when I started wanting to work in wildlife, I assumed I'd have to go outside India for it, because I didn't even realize we had so much wildlife in our country.
Right.
Um, yeah, it would be great if we could start depicting a lot of that from an early age. Um, okay, Ria Joji says, have you ever thought of trying to animate your sketches?
Actually, yes, and I'm working on that right now. So I'll tell you more about that later. I'm not supposed to talk about it right now.
Okay, we'll watch out for it then. Let's see. Are there any really interesting things you have learned about plants since you started drawing them?
Yeah, so much. I feel like with every plant that I draw, you don't forget it after that. So that's a great thing. Like even to get kids to start drawing plants, the process of drawing is so active compared to say like taking a photograph of something which is fairly like relatively passive, at least,
Mm-hmm.
depending on your level of photography or whatever. It's relatively passive. But when you're drawing something, you have to pay attention and you have to notice like everything that you're drawing, and you do not forget it. So like even the trees that I sketched while doing Pillars of Life, I can like remember that exact same tree, like forget the species, the tree itself I will remember. And things that I've learned so much because I didn't know that much before. um, so like I didn't know about what didn't are you okay? Like exact examples of things.
I guess you could answer it however you wish.
Um, in a more generic sense, I would say that like even though I'd been going to the Western Ghats so much as a kid, it was just like a sea of green, and
Mm-hmm.
now I see them as like individuals.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. Yeah. Yuvan asks, do you see any scope for art in social change, policy change, or as a political tool?
I would hope so. Like I think it could you could I mean there's different types of art, and some of it is more uh, what's the word for it? But it evokes a stronger like reaction, a more immediate reaction, right? So there's that type of art, and which mine is probably not. It's a slower form, but I think like for mine, I think I hope it just like percolates into people's mindsets. I think
Mhm.
that's my brand of art at least. But even in the nature space, like if you look at there's a cartoonist Rohan um, Green Humor. What's his name? I'm forgetting.
Rohan Chakravarti.
Chakravarti, of course, yes. I mean, had a.
Yeah.
So Rohan Chakravarti's brain humor. He's very political in his uh, in his work, and at the same time also is working with like natural history and stuff. So it's a combination of the two, and he talks a lot about the state of environmental policy in the country. So yeah, definitely very relevant.
So since we are closing in on how much time we have left, I'm just going to take a couple more questions. Tara asks, have you explored any other forests apart from the Western Ghats?
Not through my work. In general, yes, but not through my work. I would love to though. Like I think my long-term dream is to do something similar for each of like similar to Hidden Kingdom, but for each of the ecosystems in the country. Yeah, of which I will do at some point.
um, so the last question I'll take for today is from Janjri Jasani, who says, I work on climate change and mitigation in Mumbai. Education on this subject is always difficult. What would be your top suggestion for people who are trying to communicate these complex issues to both students and adults?
Yeah, so climate change is a tough one because, especially when you're communicating with children, you have to strike that balance between just depressing them and like rendering them kind of inactive, uh, and also like motivating them, right? You want to always leave on a positive note. I think what I heard a friend of mine, Prasenjit Yadav, who's a photographer, he mentioned to me that like a lot of the time climate change is spoken about everywhere around the world in terms of like just the polar bears mascot for climate change. But ultimately people will feel sad for a few minutes, but then they'll just forget about it and it seems very distant. But if you tell people in terms of like this, like he was talking about how people in who live in the grasslands in Kerala and stuff. So he would tell them that this particular bird uh, is endemic to your region, can be found nowhere else in the world. But due to climate change and habitat loss, this bird is disappearing, and that becomes much more immediate for them. They realize that it's like at their doorstep. Um, so yeah, I think to make it relevant is definitely important, and that works for kids and for adults, I think. And besides, I mean, how to be motivational, I guess we have to tell people exactly what they can do, because I think people feel like a little bit at a loss, and they feel like there's nothing that they can do to contribute. So just tell them, like, I mean, some people have asked me, what do you think about cutting down on your plastic? Is that plastic consumption, is that important to just one person? And but the way I see it, like that one plastic bottle that I might use is going to last for how many ever lots of years. I should know this, but like or maybe like a lot of years. So even if it's just one bottle and I'm just one person, the it's worth it, because it's just how long it's going to stick around.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point. I think we need to start doing a lot more relevant education, a lot more context specific stuff, and try to include as many creative visuals and work with people like yourself to make it a lot more appealing and not so dry and boring for any age group. I think even as an adult, I would much rather leaf through a book with beautiful illustrations in it about something I care about than if something which is just text.
Yeah.
So great. Thank you everybody for your questions. And thank you so much, Nirupa, for being with us and patiently walking us through your process and thinking and your journey so far. And I really hope many more people, including those from the audience today, start engaging more with art for a lot of these causes. And I hope we will all follow you and look out for more such projects and even those animated videos, hopefully. Uh, So thank you everybody, and do keep in look out for more such webinars. We do one every week. So if you follow us on social media, you'll find updates about that. And in case you've missed part of this talk or any of our previous ones, you can always find them on our YouTube channel. So thanks everybody for being here. Thanks again, Nirupa.
Bye. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.